In this video, we will learn about the history of the church in the early centuries. The Emperor Nero was named a maniac by his biographers. Public anger that was brewing over his mismanagement issues finally erupted with the destruction that came with the Great Fire of Rome. Nero, instead of taking blame for his mismanagement, made Christians the scapegoat and blamed them for the Great Fire of Rome. And he also put them to slaughter. Now, the Great Fire of Rome happened in 64 AD, and by this time, most of the New Testament was actually written except for John's Gospel and Revelation. However, by this time also, the church started meeting challenges on the theological front. So, many false teachings arose, and the church had to confront it. A man by named Marcion promoted a Gnostic version of Christianity. He disliked the Old Testament God and Paul and therefore released a canon of books without the Old Testament and the epistles of Paul. Therefore, the church was now moved to define the New Testament canon. The Old Testament, which was scripture to the Jews, the apostles, and Jesus, was naturally inherited with the same authority of scripture. And the primary category of choice for which books made it into the New Testament was made based on apostolic authority. However, except for the book of Jude, who though not an apostle, he was the brother of the Lord. Those spurious books bearing the names of the apostles were produced during this time. The church confronted them all with giant apologetic figures such as Irenaeus, who stated that just like there are only four directions of north, south, east, and west, there are only four gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, it was not until about 200 AD that we see the usage of the term New Testament. Okay, so what the term New Testament means is nothing but covenant. And I've given some how it was used in the 2nd century Christian literature, who used it. I've given the information in the slide. Those of you are interested can go through. And the word Bible actually comes from the Greek word biblos, which just means the books. Now, as you know, during this period, the early centuries were filled with Roman persecutions of Christianity. Different emperors, for different reasons, they persecuted Christians. And during one such persecution, Diocletian persecution, the Christian scriptures, the sacred books of the Christians, were burnt. So Constantine, after he becomes friendly to Christianity, only in his deathbed does he actually become, does he actually convert, or does he actually receive the faith. But he becomes friendly towards Christianity during his reign, when during one of his battles, it so happens that some of the Christian leaders go and pray for him, and he ends up winning it. It's an important battle for him, and thus forward he becomes friendly towards Christians, and he issues after the persecutions that they suffered under the early emperors, he issues an edict of religious toleration. Now, during this time, Constantine, since during the Diocletian persecution, all the Christian scriptures were burned. What Constantine promises is, he promises the church 50 codices of the Bible. Now, this is so because owning a Bible was very expensive affair those days. It's like how you own a house or a car. Not everybody gets to own it, because today we have print and electronic media. Those days they didn't have that, and they had to write in papyrus and parchments, which were expensive affairs. Okay, so making a book like that was a very expensive affair. Now, Eusebius, who is regarded as the father of church history, because he is writing in the 4th century, and he is chronicling an account of the first 3 centuries in a systematic way of chronicling the church history, the history of the church or history of Christianity in the first 3 centuries in a systematic way. He is the first person to do that. So he produces a list of universally accepted, disputed, and spurious books. So therefore, the first 4 ecumenical councils become the battleground to settle these issues, settle theological issues on the canon and some on regarding the Trinitarian and Christological controversies that arose in these early centuries. So the first council was held at Nicaea, the second was at Constantinople, third was at Ephesus, and the fourth at Chalcedon. So some of the Trinitarian and Christological heresies I've mentioned here. So it is important for us to know them because they resurface at different points in church history, and without recognizing them, they are actually they go around. Okay, these errors go around without being recognized as a heresy that was named in the early church itself. So one of it is modalism. This is regarding Trinitarian teaching. So this teaches that God is one and God He exists in three forms of three modes. So here you would have heard this analogy for the Trinity, that Trinity is like water in its three forms: ice, liquid, and vapor. Now the problem with this is water can exist at any point as only as in its one of its forms, as either as ice or liquid or vapor, right? So it is saying that God exists in three different forms or modes. So that's why it's called modalism, right? Because but the biblical teaching on Trinity is very different, because here you can see at the baptism of Jesus, all three persons of the Holy Trinity are present at the same point, same instant, okay, simultaneously present at the same instant. So it is not something like water existing in three modes, okay. So some of the Trinitarian and Christological errors or the heresies I have given, okay, you can just go through in the slides that I'm going to show you, and we call them heresies because we are talking about the doctrine of God, right? So an error can be serious in two ways. One being very grossly erroneous, okay, it's way off from the truth, or even a small error in a matter of infinite importance, right? So then also that can be a very serious error. So when you have even a small error when it's concerning the doctrine of God, it can be very considered as a very serious error, right? So that's why we call it as a heresy. So heresies are very serious errors, okay, that you cannot hold to, okay, because worship of God based on false knowledge is idolatry. So that is something we must keep in mind. So some Christological errors, so they arose in different ways. So primarily the issue was at Jesus had both a 100% human and 100% he was divine, right? He was both God and man, and so this is something that goes beyond human comprehension, because how can two opposites coexist in harmony, right? Because we have God who is immortal and man who is mortal. So how can both opposites like that coexist, right? So this is something that we accept based on the superiority of revelation to reason. Okay, so reason submits to revelation, right? So superiority of revelation. Reason deems it fit to submit to revelation. So, but the errors that came about, the Christological errors that came about in the early centuries came about because they did not submit their reason to revelation. So some of the errors I am given here, and just go through in the slides, and that will end the study of the history of the church in the first 3 centuries.